So this is going to be a talk about geography and maps, and it's absolutely vital for me to set out right at the very start that this is not a talk about politics. It's going to remain apolitical. So I'm here really just to explore what we've called fake maps, the cartography of elections. Okay, so let's get into this. We all love maps, right? It's one of the most common phrases I hear at conferences by presenters or by people coming for a job interview or for anything geographic. I think there's something very innate about the way in which geographers and cartographers love that tool of the trade, the map. But what does it really mean? And what does it mean for people who aren't necessarily geographers? Do we simply love what they look like, for instance? Or maybe it goes a little bit deeper and we love how they help shape our understanding of something. So to what extent do we know what they're telling us? Do we all have an equal innate ability to decipher the often very complex messages that they contain? Can they be trusted? We often trust maps, right? Can maps be made to tell different stories from the same data even? You know, is there just one correct map per data set, or are there alternatives that we might be able to make? And how does this translate into how maps are used and abused, perhaps in reporting elections, which is going to be the focus of today? So we're going to talk about election maps, but be aware that this kind of presentation really could apply to maps that are made about anything. So this presentation could be equally about the current pandemic, for instance, and how maps are helping to shape our understanding of what's going on there. But why elections? Well, I've kind of been fascinated with election maps for quite some time. Here's a timeline of pretty much the last decade of both American and British elections, with the main protagonists and the main points in time when general elections or presidential elections have taken place. And it's been a pretty busy period. And this is the period in which I want to focus on during this talk. Now, going back a little bit further, Harold Wilson was a British politician who served as Prime Minister in the UK from 1964 to 1970, and then also another stint, 74 to 76. And I guess as a kid growing up in the UK in the 70s, he was probably the first major politician I became aware of. And he's got a very famous quote that people often use, where he said, "A week is a long time in politics," and that's possibly never been, as more appropriate now as it was then. So ever since then, I've been fascinated with the geography and the maps of elections in the UK. And we have a kind of a similar first past the post system, but based on popular votes to determine the winner of 650 parliamentary constituencies. And the government is formed by a majority of the winners of those constituencies. So, maps are made to report that particular process. And in reality, it's normally the Conservative Party, which is the right-leaning party in the UK, or the Labour Party, which is the left-leaning party that tends to win. But why this last decade? Well, I moved to the US from the UK in 2011, and I've since become fascinated with the United States system, the political system, and also the maps that have been generated to report that process. And as somebody coming to the US, it's also helped me understand the country better, and helped me by being able to explore the geography of the politics of the US through maps. So let's go forward, not backwards. Here's a few terms that we've probably seen thrown around over the last few years. We hear a lot about fake news, about alternative facts, about a post-truth society. Who is right or who is wrong depends perhaps as much on the perspective, beliefs and biases that we hold as individuals, as much as what you see or hear or are presented by people or the media. So this presentation is called Fake Maps, but election maps are rarely fake. None are right, none are wrong. They all tend to tell different shades of the truth. So you could actually call them alternative maps as opposed to fake maps. And there's another famous quote I'd like to share with you. The Welsh politician Aneurin Bevan in the late 1940s, his quote, "This is my truth, tell me yours," on the way in which politicians of that time seemingly avoided telling the truth in favour of alternative facts. So even fake news isn't new, right? And I'd like you to keep that phrase in mind as we explore the alternative maps in this particular presentation. And we're going to look at a few examples from the last decade, alongside some of my own work from the forthcoming book, and why I make maps of election data. And then towards the end, we'll finish with a brief look at some of the ways in which the current presidential election forecasting is using maps and charts, graphs, and plots to help us understand what's going on in the run-up to the next election. Okay. So we all love maps, right? Politicians also love maps, particularly colourful ones that reflect political affiliations with particular party colours. The way maps are used to tell a particular story becomes part of the narrative, the messaging, perhaps the spin. And this is a very famous picture that was taken when President Trump moved into the White House. And Reuters quotes him at this moment saying, "Here, you can take that. That's the final map of the numbers. It's pretty good, right? The red is obviously us." And many claimed his map was wrong. We're going to come on to that. But maps are supposed to give us a trusted mechanism, but they can also be used for persuasion, for propaganda. And again, this is nothing new. Maps have always been used as devices to persuade people of facts, whether they're truthful or not. And then the journalist Trey Yingst took a photograph of this particular map, the same map, blown up as a larger example that the president was putting on the wall in the White House. Now, you know, I've come back to this fact. Who wouldn't have put a map of their victory on their own wall? I would. And this is the map that was chosen to go on the wall. And it isn't wrong, despite the claims of many that it presents an incorrect or an untruthful version of reality. Yes, it presents a partisan view of the truth. Geography, population density, electoral geographies modify the message in a very specific way. And I guess that's what people were critical of. But this map particularly suits Trump's view of the truth. It has an awful lot of red on it. It speaks to his victory. And this type of map is only one form of mapping of election results, and many alternative maps might have been made. And I actually used this map in one of the pages in the book that Esri Press published in 2018, called Cartography, and I wanted to use it to explore some of the issues surrounding the ethics in map making. What constitutes a truthful map? So this is really a talk about how the message is mediated through the map, not whether a map is right or wrong. And as I'll re-emphasize, this map isn't wrong. And if I, or rather anyone else, because I can't be elected president, if anybody else would be elected a Republican president, this is exactly the map to hang on your wall. Let's move on to some alternative maps. I'm going to start with a French version, but then move into some examples of the UK first. This is possibly the first election map, a unique values map by French lithographer Montizon. It's his map of political France in 1834. The Resistance Party won with a 69.5% share of the vote, and they're depicted in blue. The Movement Party, led by was second with 16.3%, and that's represented by red. And then there was about 14% of other candidates, and they don't really even appear on the map. Again, it's a sort of a first past the post for each of these areas, and it's kind of interesting that the red-blue scheme that we're very familiar with in many countries was used more than 200 years ago. Blue in this case for the centre-right party, and red for the centre-left, and we'll revisit this meaning of colour later on. And in the UK, the Times newspaper was fairly innovative early on, and this is on the left, an attempt to make a map of the election results that disregarded conventional physical geography, and it's a cartogram published in 1895, and it's a map of people, not of unequal constituency geography, and this is a theme that we'll keep returning to. So the parliamentary geography of the UK is represented as tessellating squares of equal size. There's a sort of a black, white, grey distinction showing whether areas were urban boroughs, metropolitan boroughs, or even university areas. And then on the right, in 1964 and also 1966, a topologically correct cartogram of the UK created by Thomas Hollingsworth continues this desire to equalise our geographical view of the world and to instead present the relative importance of political units over geographical units. And this tradition has been very much at the fore in British electoral cartography. British geographer Danny Dorlin has mapped many elections Here's a set of maps from the 1990s that get very diagrammatic. On the left, the parliamentary seats have been coloured by share of the vote, and it's shown the swing between the election cycles of 1983 and 1987. Blue is very right-leaning, red is very left-leaning, and we get a lot of purple in the middle, where there's a much more marginal situation. And on the right, he created another cartogram, but also married it with another technique that we refer to as a Chernoff face technique that attempts to convey the election outcome, a simple result, but by colour, also mapped onto a human face to show various social indicators through different ways of changing facial features on the map. It's sometimes regarded as a little bit of a controversial technique, but it's clearly an attempt to characterise the typical result of the election as a function of social and economic conditions. And these, of course, play into the reasons why votes go the way in which they do. A little bit further up to date, in the 2010 UK election, most news agencies went with the standard geographic map, as you can see on the left. The results are coloured by winning party. Again, blue is right-leaning Conservatives, red is left-leaning Labour, and there's a whole bunch of other colours, which is the way in which we like it in the UK. We have an awful lot of people contesting each parliamentary seat. But the difficulty with the geographical map is that larger political constituencies dominate in terms of visual terms. They're simply bigger and therefore more visible. Smaller inner city, often more highly populated areas can hardly be seen on a national map like this. So from that map on the left, you might expect that the Blues won, and they didn't, in fact. It was a hung parliament, which means there was no majority winner, and a government had to be formed through a pact between the Blues and, in this case, the Oranges. On the right, cartograms such as this offer a form of thematic mapping that accommodates the differences in these original land sizes of areas, and we use hexagons to tessellate to create a gridded cartogram. And now you can easily see, let's say, the massive expansion of the constituencies of Greater London because there's a more equal focus on them. So each hexagon is now equal sized in terms of the area which occupies on the map, reflecting the equal voting power of each member of parliament. And it's actually now much more easy to see on this map that blue didn't have a majority on its own. And most news agencies went with a hexagonal cartogram for the 2015 UK elections, reinforcing this idea that mapping people in abstract political units is a more truthful mechanism than reporting physical geography. Interestingly, the independent newspaper on the right actually went with cartograms on their website, but they included a geographical map in their print product. And the BBC, being the BBC, spent all our taxpayers' money on a giant physical map in the piazza at the entrance of their main television centre facility. And they filled the map in as the results came in. And of course, maps, they can be fun too, right? So a lot of different illustrations and memes started doing the rounds as the results came in, some frivolous, some humorous. The Scottish National Party made many great gains. So comparisons with Maggie Simpson started proliferating social media feeds, which was kind of funny. Somebody called Roderick compared the final map down the bottom left with a quick sketch of traditional coal mining areas. And he wanted to make the point that really the map was a function of, the differences between the traditional industrial heartlands in the UK, staunch Labour red areas, and the rest of the country, which was a little bit more centre right. And then there was a fascinating cross stitch which somebody actually did live on Twitter as the results came in, which basically shows that you can make maps of anything in any way you particularly liked. So I did the same. After the results came in, I started experimenting, and there are many ways to map the election results. And I created this map, which I called the Election Pollocks. I think of it as a spin on a Jackson Pollock artistic representation. And there are 12 or 13 different parties contesting the different constituencies in the UK. And I thought, well, why don't I just make a complex pattern of voting as abstract art using paint to create perhaps a fascinating picture of the political colour across the UK. So the different sized and coloured symbols and their pseudo-random application gives it a much more less structured appearance. And I like this messy metaphor allowing the paint to mix to give visual prominence to the winners, but also to show that each constituency had votes that went another way. Okay. I turned the hexagonal cartogram into a three-dimensional version, maybe as a way to show different layers that illustrate who won as the top layer. Perhaps you strip that off and look at the layer that came second. Perhaps you can start to dive into the sort of stratigraphy of each constituency. And I use the links to I use colour across the map to give a recognisable link to political affiliation. And there's a kind of an undulation to the landscape as well that gave some sense of voter turnout across the map. And then I did it again for the 2016 Brexit result, where the UK decided, in its infinite wisdom, to leave the European Union by 51% to 49%. I don't like this map. It doesn't really work. And here's a point I often make, that sometimes maps don't work very well. And this one, because of occlusion, you can't really disentangle what's going on. And sometimes experiments are best left perhaps unpublished, rather than simply expecting your map reader to disentangle what you've made. And this is a friend and colleague of mine, Ben Hennig, who mapped the most recent 2019 election in 3 different ways, side by side, just in case one map wasn't enough. But I think what he really did here was say that there's no single map that can provide you with all of the information and the clear visual information. But by putting these 3 types of maps side by side, it actually allows you to gain different insights from the best bits of each one. There's a geographical view, which we're very familiar with. There's the constituency view, which kind of pushes us to look at political units in equal sizes. And then there's the population view, which says, well, OK, but how many people actually live in these places? And that gives us a different view entirely. Now, I mean, that's a brief view of some of the UK political geography. If you're interested in a deeper dive into that, I did actually write a paper with Danny Dorling on this a couple of years ago in the International Journal of Cartography. But we're going to switch our attention to the US, and we'll start off with this particular map. It's perhaps the first US election map. It appeared in a US Census Bureau atlas in 1883. It's the map of the 1880 presidential election. And it's effectively a choropleth map of the percentage share of vote. But there's a lot of really nice touches on this map. There's graphs, there's charts, and a summary at state level that accompany the map. And so even back in 1883, there's a reflection or an understanding that the map on its own perhaps doesn't tell the whole story. And by adding charts and graphs and statistical information and numbers and headline figures, you perhaps give people a much greater set of graphics and information that help them to understand the complexity of what they're looking at. On this map, red is Democrat, blue is Republican, which matches the left and right leaning colours we've seen on the French and French and UK maps we've already seen, but isn't the current political colours of the US. So they switched. If we fast forward to the 2016 election, not only have the colours switched, but we've got a range of different map types as well. So we've got red for Democrats, blue for Republicans, was still fairly widely used up until about the 1980s, when actually TV networks and the prevalence of colour televisions and graphics underpinned a change. And in 1984, CBS in particular switched the colours in its reporting. By 1996, colour schemes were relatively mixed. CNN, CBS, ABC, the New York Times referred to Democratic states with colour blue, Republican ones as red, and Time and Washington Post used the opposite scheme. NBC used to use the colour blue for the incumbent party, which is why blue represented the Democrats in 2000. And in the days following the 2000 election, whose outcome was pretty unclear for some time after election day, major media outlets began conforming to the same colour scheme, which is pretty much what we have today now. But map types differ. So red for Republicans, blue for Democrats. In the top left, the New York Times, just the basic red-blue win with darker red to show flip states, and that's the result. That's Often it's referred to as oversimplified, but it's not really. That's the result of the election, because that's how states map onto the electoral college system. They also, though, in the middle top, New York Times had a swing map to show just how much the move from left to right was in 2016. In the top right, we have a cartogram from Daily Kos. It's a fractured gridded cartogram of congressional districts in this case, introducing the notion that we have different scales of geographies, states, counties, congressional districts, precincts, all of which give us a different view of the reality of the outcome. And to that point, down in the bottom left, the Wall Street Journal had a square gridded cartogram of electoral college units juxtaposed with a geographical map, so they allowed you to switch between them. NPR, bottom middle, went with a Demir's cartogram on non-contiguous squares. Kind of looks like the US, but you know, isn't. It's very graphical. And then the Washington Post in the bottom right actually flipped things a little bit and went with a somewhat innovative diamond gridded cartogram. But the interesting thing about these 6 maps that I wanted to pick up is look at the one in the top left and the top and the bottom right. So top left, bottom right. They each have an additional single bar, a graphic that shows the results. Not quite in the bottom right, because I took that screen grab before the result was known. And actually, that's a really informative way of reporting the result. Maybe the map could be argued to be overcomplicating matters. Other examples, this again from the Washington Post, create a beautiful map of mountains across a landscape, and the peaks were drawn with line thicknesses to emphasize voting strength. So color shows the winner, bold lines are a landslide victory, height is total vote, base width is margin of victory. And there's an awful lot packed into a relatively simple graphic. And again, that's a key piece of information here when you're designing maps. This map looks simple, but it conveys an awful lot of information in a very, very compact manner. So you don't have to oversimplify graphics in order to convey meaning. You can actually just design the map to use graphics in a very meaningful way. What was also very interesting about this map is it was positioned on its side with the west coast at the bottom and the east coast at the top, and that suited web and mobile delivery. So you reorientate the states so that you can scroll up and down to fit a portrait device, as opposed to the traditional landscape device that we more commonly see the US positioned in. 538 went with the gridded cartogram of electoral college votes that were sort of summed up to show how many each state has. And they also used something that was non-map-like, which was what they referred to as a snake diagram, showing strong support at either extremity with very, very partisan states at each end of the snake diagram. But as you veer towards the middle in that magic 270 electoral college vote line, you start to get into much more marginal territory. And these very key states where candidates are going to be focusing a lot of activity to try to win the electoral college votes that go with those states. And I did really quite like this graphic as a way of sort of meandering to victory, or the path to victory in many ways. So we're back to the idea that graphs can sometimes be better, certainly for headline figures. I like this from the Wall Street Journal, published a Daisometric Map, which basically smooshes data from large arbitrary boundaries into where people live. So it emphasizes the population distribution of the US and clearly demonstrates where votes took place and also where there isn't anyone there to vote. So the pockets of high density democratic leaning show in urban areas. They can be clearly identified in comparison with sparsely populated areas, which is predominantly Trump territory, but which perhaps extends over larger portions of the country. So it maps people, not landmass. And that's great, except the drawback of this sort of map, at a national scale at least, and at this sort of size, is that any map of any variable of any statistic reapportioned into populated places will probably look exactly the same as this map. We'll revisit this one later though, because I think it's kind of interesting. The Financial Times in the UK also attempted an innovative solution referred to as the compromise, which is kind of interesting because compromise is key in cartography. You're always making compromises about what you show and how you show it. And in effect, they try to take the best components from other mapping techniques to arrive at a solution. They've got an underlying geography to allow people to much more readily understand where it is they're looking at, to provide a sense of familiarity and recognition. But each geographical area has a number of dots or counters overlaid that represent the electoral college votes, and they're coloured by the winner of that particular state. So they in themselves are equally sized, and so the map gives the correct visual weight to support comparisons across the map that take account of the distribution of the electoral college votes. And look at the top again. Again, the bar graphic is used as the headline. Almost the map is subservient to that headline figure. And of course, maps can be artistic. I absolutely love this map from Tim Wallace of the New York Times. A beautifully imagined landscape as an artistic representation of the result of the winner. This is Trump's America, taking topography but punched out using, broadly speaking, the areas that he won. And then, of course, if we've got a map of the winner, we have the converse or the inverse. We also have a map of the loser. So this is Clinton's much more fractured, I guess, urban area islands map. But the New York Times did something really interesting. They also produced a massive large format print product, a huge fold out in the print publication, which is absolutely beautiful in many respects, mapping the voting patterns by zip code. It's magnificent in many ways. It's a large format, it's eye-catching, it's detailed. Marginal results are shown in yellow, so it's not just typically red-blue. Now, from my perspective, just my opinion, I think they made a misstep here by reverting to a geographical map after so much sort of work that they put in online to go for cartograms. And it's back to emphasising geography again, those very sparsely populated areas towards the west of the country, which still on this map have large blocks of dark red. And that tends to overawe the visual sense that we get. We don't necessarily see the marginal areas, which are quite important in this context, particularly in the Midwest, where states flipped, which were key to Trump's victory. And I thought this was fantastic because almost immediately in my Twitter feed were two of my pals. This is Brian Timoney at the top, who called this a miss. And then immediately, I haven't photoshopped this, immediately another friend of mine, Charlie Glynn, said, this is really cool, it's a hit. And I guess this is kind of interesting because these two reactions from two cartographic experts appeared adjacent in my timeline, proving absolutely that if you ask 10 cartographers how to make a map, you'll get 10 different answers. And that's the truth. Talking of the truth or the non-truth, I'm going to finish this little section of review by looking at some maps that went viral. There's 3 maps here, and they're all bizarre in some senses, but they swept across the internet. And here's the important thing: this use of social media to project a situation or a map, or to share something. You know, we have to be very thoughtful or considerate about this, because these maps aren't necessarily the best maps you'd want if you were trying to be an objective sharer. But of course, these people aren't, right? The Breitbart map was incredible. It's actually incorrect, and I still to this day don't know how it was constructed. It was actually eventually taken down 9 months after his victory. In the top right, no, sorry, bottom middle, President Trump's love of maps shines through again. He retweeted this map, which was based on precinct data, much more detailed data, and it was referred to as a more accurate map. Well, again, I'm not sure. It's not more accurate. It's perhaps at a different scale, and it shows more detail, but the state map is just as accurate. And then the top right, the use of the map as maybe a propagandist tool, as part of the try to impeach this narrative, perhaps to reinforce a message to the base and supporters, perhaps to sow seeds of doubt into opponents. Either way, you know, you can see there 62,500 retweets shows the power of social media to share something, perhaps more so than many of the maps I've shown you in this presentation so far. Okay, so we've seen a broad range of map types so far. Some we might call more truthful than others. And what can be done about these alternative maps? Well, partly it's down to map makers and down to their motives, but it's also down to the map consumer to be savvy enough to be able to interpret what it is they're seeing, be able to cut through the things that are perhaps less truthful when they see it. More specifically, how can we as geographers and cartographers inform the general population of how to recognise inherent bias that exists in maps that they are fed? Well, I'm trying to, in a really small way, just in my own little part of the world, to try to create a place to evidence and to inform about the maps. Now, I put this together for the 2012 election. It was a gallery of about 20 different maps with notes on benefits, constraints, data needs, how they mediate the message. And I continued doing that for the 2016 election with maybe about 35 or 40 maps. And there's a couple of URLs that you can go to there, particularly the bottom one, which will take you directly to this gallery of maps. So obviously some of this underpins my day job at Esri by stretching our software, creating the maps to demonstrate what you can do as a mechanism for testing, and also as a way to provide descriptive workflows. How do you make these maps, and how do you educate people into how to make these maps? So I've been delivering a technical workshop at our conference on this for many years now, and why? Well, I guess every 4 years I have to make a whole new set of maps, so it's job security, right? And that's always a great thing. One of these maps, though, went a little bit viral, and in early March 2018 I made this map. It's a Daisometric density map, so you've already seen one of those, but this is one vote is one dot. And to date, it's had an awful lot of retweets, maybe 5,000 times. It's apparently been seen by 2 million people, which is nuts, and led to 250,000 active engagements, whatever on earth they actually are. And of course, what happens when something goes a little bit viral is memes start to appear. And now we start to get into some fun stuff, because this guy, Thomas de Boer, actually mashed up my map into the map that Trey Yingst saw being hung in the White House. And of course, these memes just start to go viral themselves, because that is not the map that President Trump would put on his White House wall. Things took off a little bit more. It got some traction in news outlets. People started to realize that there isn't just a single map of an election result, that there are many, many different variants. So I was able to participate in a number of interviews and talk to different media outlets to really talk through the importance of cartography. And naturally, that led me to thinking, maybe I could turn this into another book. So as you'll probably rightly guessed by now, this book's going to have used the 2016 presidential election data. I'm going to give you a sneak peek into it. Disclaimer: this is currently going through the editorial process, so even this cover and some of the maps that I'm going to show you might turn up in a slightly different format. But it allowed me to talk about this first topic of map projections, and we could spend hours on this, but we won't. Most of the maps you've seen so far in this presentation have actually done a very good job at following best practice, but it's important to emphasize that thematic maps of statistical data demand an equal area projection. This is WebMercator. Doesn't work very well for thematic maps, and certainly not for the US, because you know, there's different parts of the US that exist in different parts on the globe, and you can't really map them close to one another just because of geography. And then not least, you have Alaska, which is basically 4 times larger than many of the states in the lower 48 and gives a different visual prominence. So that's one page in the book, which quickly turns into maps that use the Albers equal area conic projection, a far better projection for thematic maps, because it uses equal area as its special property. And I was able to put Alaska and Hawaii in insets here as well, which pushed them into the same sort of visual area. I was able to discuss color choices and particularly look at the ideas of, well, does the traditional red and blue actually work for people with different color vision? Even those with deuteranopia, lacking the ability to see green, they'd still be able to see the major differences in the map. So it was important to test you know, traditional color schemes against some of these ideas. It'll allow me to get into the issue of redistricting, which I'm not going to go into in too much detail here. Here's just a hypothetical example. And if you take 100 units and geographically tile them in different ways, when you aggregate them up, you get a completely different outcome at state level. It's really part of what we know in geography as the modifiable areal unit problem, where decisions on where boundaries are placed has a huge impact on how data is aggregated and therefore how results are created. And here's a real example. This is the famous example of the 4th Congressional District of Illinois, one of the oldest US political geographies. But look how it's changed shape massively over time. It's previously been 2 unconnected areas. Even today is only connected to the west by a narrow strip, Interstate 294. And it's been done really to delineate mainly Hispanic districts in Chicago, which of course starts to introduce accusations that redistricting like this could be seen as being racially biased, or maybe is racially biased. But the impact of this is either to pool voters to ensure support or to concede victory in favour of making gains elsewhere. So whatever the debates about motivation, it impacts aggregation of votes and the map, because the map reflects the choices of boundary, historical decisions, potentially politically motivated decisions. I was able to get into one of my favourite topics, which is normalizing choropleths. This is a map of the Republican share of vote, not even share of vote, the Republican total votes by counties. And you would expect this distribution because regardless of the share, you're always going to get more votes in areas where there's more people. And this map doesn't provide a consistent basis for comparing one place with another across the map. So for a map like this, the choropleth, or an area shaded map, you have to accommodate different population densities and use a rate in order to compare like for like across the map. So this is the more truthful version of that data. It's normalized. It's a percentage, the share of vote, to account for population. You get a completely different message than the previous map. And of course, then we get into the realms of classifying data. How much red do you want on your map? Well, you can broadly speaking put as much red, or if you made the inverse map over the Democratic share, blue, by determining different ways of classifying or binning your data. Okay, but what about a range of the maps themselves? Let's cycle fairly quickly through some of these. Here's the typical result map, red and blue. I like it because it tells you the result. And if that's the only job that your map needs to do, this is the map to use. I did add a crosshatch fill in some of the states just to show that these were the states that were flipped from Democrat in 2012 to Republican in 2016. And I did that because it adds just a little bit of context. It takes the message on a little bit further. Now, one thing to notice on this map is there's scribbles all over it. And whilst I'm not going to pause and read through them, they're in the book where I call out aspects of the design and the technique, but also where it impacts on how people interpret the results or the information in a particular area. So this book is very much meant to show the map or a result, but also some of the process and some of the ways in which we perceive and understand what it is we're seeing. We could perhaps very quickly get into a more interesting map. This is a value by alpha map at county level. It uses a blended colour scheme from red through purple to blue, but it also adds a layer of opacity where the population is more sparse. So it has the effect of downplaying all those dark red high share of the vote, sparsely populated counties in the west. And that inset in the top left for the bottom 4 counties in Utah illustrates it. Areas with very similar shares of the vote, but once you actually put in the opacity, you can see how much of an impact these might or might not have in the overall aggregate. So you could look at this map and say, is it more balanced than just the red-blue map? Is it perhaps a more nuanced version of the results? Maybe what it does is allow you to look at it and explore information in more detail. But maybe you could take that and emphasize, let's say, Clinton's part of the map, and this is what this particular version does. So even though there's quite a lot of red or reddish hue on the map, or purple that tends towards a red, if we add a sort of a hill shade, which is what we do on topographic maps to show relief, we can actually make some of Clinton's urban counties sort of seem to stand out a little bit from the rest, or from the background on the map. So we can use artistic techniques to emphasize certain parts of a map. From my perspective, I was really fascinated when I just looked at the counties that had flipped. It's surprisingly few. These are where a lot of campaigning is targeted. This is where elections are won or lost. So if we just get rid of all of those counties that voted the same in 2012 and 2016, this is what we're left with. And I was very, very surprised by this map, but it tells an interesting story. And in fact, when you delve into the numbers, President Trump won off the back of flipping Michigan, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin by less than 1% in each case, which equates to around 80,000 people in each state, which is remarkably small numbers when you think about it in the context of the entire population. Small multiples are a great technique for showing change over time. Now here, the red and the blue is consistent based on today's colours. I haven't switched them back in the mid-80s, but fascinating to see where perhaps states have remained largely the same, where they flipped one way and stayed that way, or maybe where they keep flipping back and forth, or how perhaps even nationally, in particular election cycles, most of the country has just taken a very specific view and turned most of the country blue or most of the country red. And this is an interesting map to me. Remember the question I asked at the start was, well, Trump put his map on the White House wall. What might Hillary Clinton's map have looked like? I think she might have gone with something like this. But this, of course, is the popular vote map with symbols proportional to that vote. And as we know, the popular vote doesn't count at all. So the massive small red symbols ultimately overawed these few very large blue symbols. But actually, I thought about this a little more, and I thought, I wonder whether President Trump missed a trick. In some respects, he might have actually presented this map to the news and the press and said, look at all that blue, and yet we still won, because that's the truth. We could be a little bit playful. We could use electoral college symbology and translate that popular vote map, which bends the truth towards a Clinton view of reality, but look at these symbols as proportional to electoral college votes, and we look at how balance of red comes back into play, particularly in states like Texas and Florida, where a single state makes giant gains. And here's the Daisometric density map, but with less saturated colours than the Wall Street Journal version you saw much earlier. What it does is emphasise again how much of the US is very, very sparsely populated, or in great swathes unpopulated. What I've tried to do is mix the dot colours, so many places aren't as blue or red as they might at first seem. Many places are actually a lot more similar than they are different, so you tend to see a lot more purple coming through on this map. So the harsh red-blue map, when you look at a map like this, might actually be seen to show a strength of division across the country that isn't actually the case. Now, I'm going to show you a map now that I have developed based off this, and I've created a poster, a very large poster of this exact same information, and I've also put a little bit of one of those snake diagrams around the outside as a border, a little bit like the 538 example. Now, this may come as a little map that comes as part of the book. I don't know yet. If it doesn't, it'll be available for download, and you can print it and put it on a wall if you so wish. That's if it speaks to your truth. It might not, I don't know. But what I found fascinating when I put this map together is that I decided to include some topographic detail, and particularly mountain ranges and topography. And it really helps to understand or demonstrate the settlement patterns of the US as much as it does to show the result itself. So geography matters, and explains an awful lot about patterns in data. In this case, to support the idea of, well, why is it that there's a lot of sparse patterns in the west of the country? Well, there's a reality. I mean, it's geography. It gets in the way. I actually like this version. A lot of people might say, well, if you make a map, it's you're actually obfuscating data through map symbology. Why don't you just put the numbers on the map? And I think there's an opportunity to, with particularly county level data in the US. And this map shows the percentage share of vote just as a literal symbol. The number is the value, the percentage. But if you apply a little bit of color, a little bit of sizing to the symbols to make it proportional, a little bit of transparency to give it a depth, so you kind of promote some of the big numbers, and you add some saturation to the very high share of votes, you kind of get that version of President Trump's map, but with the data, which allows you to actually recover the actual information from the map itself rather than have to look at different shades across the map. We could break away from boundaries altogether. We can look at contours. It's perhaps a much more organic view of the data. So here we get maybe a feel for plateaus of partisan core support, maybe valleys of bipartisanship across the country. And then I thought, well, if most maps are there to show similarity, why don't we show dissimilarity? And this may be about, where you have a chat over your neighbour's fence about how things are going. And this is where neighbours are shown to vote the same way with the same colour line in between adjacent counties, or where they differ, and by how much, which is the thickness and the strength of the colour of the line. And actually what you end up with is large tracts of the US voting in very similar ways, punctuated by sort of small enclaves of differing support. And this does in some respects speak to Waldo Tobler's first law of geography of near things being more similar to one another than things that are farther apart, although obviously there's exceptions. What happens if we take the flipped counties and look at the swing in those counties? So here we're muting everything on the map except just those counties that flipped, and showing them as a strength of swing. And you can see very, very clearly here that the Midwest was crucial to President Trump's victory. Okay, I'm going to rifle through just a few more. We're getting a little tight for time, and before I want to end up with some current thinking in news organizations. So you can't have a map without making it look like the Stars and Stripes, right? It's just transects, it's cross sections. Again, share of the vote, stars showing cities, and then their sort of surrounding results. A range of cartograms. Here a non-contiguous cartogram where each state is sized according to the total vote. We saw one of these population density equalizing cartograms that Ben Hennig did for the UK, and here's the American county version. This tends to create visceral reactions, so I can imagine people watching this presentation now going, oh hey, I love it, or oh, what is that? I mean, that's just the way this map type comes out. Here's a Dawling cartogram, so all the counties are circles. And finally, my attempt to recreate Danny Dawling's 1980s mashup of a cartogram and a Chernoff face representation to show how the results relate to social and economic conditions for today's America. But that's a complex map. And like I said, maybe we just go for simple infographics, proportional symbols of electoral college votes as a series of balloons to get the party started. We might put graphs on maps. Why don't we integrate the two? Rather than having maps and graphs, putting graphs on maps can help us perhaps understand patterns. This is a waffle grid of votes. Each cell is 20,000 votes. And when you look at it something like this, rather than just having the stark red, blue winner takes it all vote, you do start to look and see, actually, things are pretty similar in many, many states. And that's a pattern that I also saw when I created some Sankey diagrams to show the change from 2012 to 2016. Again, it's margins, fine margins in many, many cases that transferred power. So I'll finish my section or section on my maps by just looking at some 3D maps. This one as an example in the book of what not to do necessarily. It's impactful, it's wonderful, and we love spinny globes, but it's a very difficult map to interpret because prisms have now got total vote encoded into the Z dimension or the Z dimension, and you don't really know, because of foreshortening and the angle of view, which are the larger ones and which are the shorter ones. It's not a particularly easy map to interpret, but that doesn't mean to say 3D isn't useful. So this version, which uses an isometric projection as a way of positioning the point of view so that scale is equivalent across the map, actually does allow you to compare the front to the back. And of course, if you're in a 3D environment or a web app, interaction and the ability to rotate overcomes occlusion. Now, remember I did this with the UK data, so I thought I'd do it with the US data, but use time or election cycles stacked one on top of each other. And the ability to slice and dice things both horizontally and vertically to show different election cycles, or even to look at the stratigraphy through a web app, allows an awful lot of potential for 3D cartography, when perhaps even maybe 4 or 5 years ago, you know, I would be recommending 3D maps like this are things to avoid. I think interactive environments have brought a new ability to see these kind of geographies in very different ways. And my final example is maybe a 3D infographic. These are just signposts. Again, through time, looking at the way in which the vote went from left to right in different periods for each of the states. It's very compact, but there's an awful lot of information in this particular graphic. So let's finish with a little look on what's going on with some of the current forecasting of the 2020 situation. These are screenshots taken from last Monday, September the 21st, and this is from The Economist, and they lead with a line graph and some headline numbers, no map at all. And what I really like about this is they use elements of uncertainty in their lines, because as we well know, forecasts are exceedingly uncertain. And I think uncertainty is a key theme going into any election, but perhaps now more than ever with the reality of, you know, maybe mail-in ballots. How's that going to be impacted or countered effectively? What's the impact of the pandemic on turnout maybe, or even on campaigning? So having that element of uncertainty in a graphic, I think, is very, very important. And what's even more impressive is they explain it. Okay, they explain what these lines mean and how you're supposed to interpret them, rather than just leaving it simply to the reader to disentangle. They do have a map. They use proportional symbols to illustrate the probability of winning based on the forecasts. And the stronger the colour, the safer they feel that the state is in terms of their forecasted victory for each of the candidates. And the most uncertain states get a dark outline for emphasis. And this is interactive, so you can start to experiment with moving that timeline at the bottom, or I guess it's a state line, and looking at the different probabilities of winners for different states. What I also liked about The Economist is they're providing context for a lot of different aspects of the election. So this is an intriguing map showing how alike different states are in terms of their historical voting habits, and also in relation to the demographic makeup of different states. So I just use this as an example to show to which extent other states are similar to South Carolina in terms of their historical voting. More importantly, though, I kind of wanted to use this because it's one of the only maps that I've shown that hasn't used red or blue. So red and blue is very, very closely associated with results or outcomes maps. Here is a theme which is not about the outcome. So we changed the colour, or they've changed the colour, in order to try to avoid confusion with the other maps on their site. 538 is doing some pretty great work. Here's a title splash with small multiples showing different scenarios. And they're also using a little pop-up called 5e Fox that again helps people and guides them through the maps and graphics that they're showing. And this again helps the context of people navigating what they're seeing. They use a bee swarm plot with little map pop-ups, which is kind of cute, cartoon pictures. And they're bringing back their snake diagram. But notice that it's no longer left-right oriented, it's rotated so that it's in portrait mode, which I'm assuming, I don't know, but I'm assuming they've done so that it's much more suited to mobile devices that we tend to look at vertically. And this is the New York Times on their website, focusing on battleground states, and interactivity allows you to drag different states into a Democrat bubble or a Republican bubble, each of which is a set of Voronoi polygons where segments reflect the number of electoral college votes. Overall size shows the wins as they pass that kind of 270 magical mark and that dotted outline. And the small thumbnails at the bottom, again, the maps are kind of subservient to the graphics, but they allow you to shortcut to different scenarios. It's just an example of dragging one state into another. And the Washington Post are also going with maybe an artsy depiction, showing that you don't have to go with, you know, a sort of a very, you know, very stark, almost sterile approach to mapping with, you know, proper lines and coloured in. Why not do a hand-drawn approach, even though it's delivered on the web? And this is kind of an interesting approach that the Washington Post have taken here, focusing on descriptive vignettes of various swing states. Okay, so that's how some of the media are using their websites to show things. So I'm just going to finish up with a few comments. So finally, back to one of my maps. I've not touched on this at all today. This is satirical cartography. It's a whole other strand of cartography that we often see around elections. So in 2007, I got my pens and pencils out, and I just started drawing a map for the first time in a very long time, and made my own satirical map based on copying the maps of a famous satirist called Edward Rose. And it ended up looking like this. So with apologies to Rose, who created octopuses. There were a lot of famous octopuses in his satirical maps with tentacles reaching out all over the place. So I blatantly took that, and I kind of looked at the first 100 days of President Trump's time in office and just started playing. Okay, and this is satire. It's pure satire. And I got this map out you know, a few weeks ago and had another look at it, and I was astonished at actually how little of this is relevant any longer. So I go back to that quote I used at the start, Harold Wilson, who said a week is a long time in politics. And certainly if we spent so much time on this map, this content has been rewritten many times in the weeks and months since I drew it. So unless you want to give me another hour, that's pretty much it. The point is, with so many design choices, fake maps or alternative maps are abound. You can make a map say anything you want, and people are making them to say anything that they want. Cartograms, I love them. You might not. They still polarize opinion, yet they've been used on and off for the best part of 150 years to map elections, and particularly gridded cartograms are currently in vogue on both sides of the Atlantic. So experimentation continues, and I would encourage experimentation. Even the 101 maps I've made in the book isn't the full list. You can just keep going. And clearly data journalism in many respects is driving a lot of this innovation. It's worth reiterating that bar one or two, none of the maps I've shown you are right. None of them are wrong. They all speak to that quote, tell me your truth, and you know, different versions of the truth. And I guess some are going to have spoken to you more than others, and some speak to me more than others as well. So if you're designing maps to report statistical data, it's kind of behoves you to appreciate how your choices are going to impact how the map is going to be read, and more widely being able to recognize the bias in the map's representation is an important issue, and it's incumbent on all of us because it plays to people's views, opinions, the search for truth. And I'll finish by saying, not just, this is my truth, tell me yours, but all maps lie. And Marc Monnier has published a very famous book with a very, very similar title. But all maps lie, though, to an extent. And it's the extent of that lie that's important to recognise, both as map makers and as map readers. So I've kind of snuck over a little bit, but thank you very much for listening, if indeed you are still listening. And I'm going to stop there.